All right, welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for being on today and for joining us for this back Q&A. I want to apologize for the background that I have being backwards. I just realized that right before we went live and did not have a chance to fix it. So please bear with us on that and any future technical barriers which we may or may not experience tonight. To introduce everybody, my name is Mariah Mason. I am a public engagement specialist here at the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and my coworker Alexandra Hicks will be helping out behind the scenes with our Q&A functionality for the event. And with us today, we have our DNR state mammalogists, Brad Westrich and Tim Shier. So in a moment, you'll be able to meet them and they can introduce themselves. But before we jump into that, I just want to go over the functionality of Teams Live because it looks a little bit different than some of the other meetings you all may be accustomed to seeing. So Teams Live is a webinar platform and obviously, because here we are, and it will allow you to submit questions for this Q&A, which is great, but we will not be able to see you. So while this event is recorded and we will be able to interact via question and answer, we won't actually be able to see anybody in the audience, so there won't have to be any worries about that. And when we are done recording this event, we'll be able to post it to social media so other people can learn more information about bats who weren't able to make it tonight. If you are interested in using closed captions, you should be able to go to the settings in this Teams Live event, turn on closed captions if that would be helpful to you. And if you have any other questions throughout the event, hopefully bat related, but also if you have tech related questions, you can pop those into the Q&A section of the event and we will be able to address those. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and turn the stage over to Brad and Tim so they can introduce themselves and talk a little bit about why we are talking about bats at this time of year.
Very much, Mariah. So as you mentioned, I am Brad Westrich. I'm the state mammologist with Indiana DNR.
And I'm Tim Shier. I'm the assistant state mammologist.
And together, part of our job duties are to cover the state and monitor the rare and endangered species of mammals that Indiana is proud to have. And that includes a lot of bats. So for some of the bat monitoring we do, we get out in the field, we go into caves to count bats in the winter months when they're hibernating. We use some acoustic devices, essentially fancy microphones that can pick up bat echolocation calls. We record those across the state during the spring, summer, and fall and get an idea of where bats are and what habitats they're using.
Yeah, no, this time of year, a lot of bats are emerging back on the landscape from hibernation or migration. So it's a pretty common time of year for people to maybe see a bat flying around or lots of bats flying around or see a bat hanging out on the side of their house or any place like that. So it's a good time of year to have this event when bats are starting to become more visible on the landscape again.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And I know that you mentioned that, we're here today because bats are more prevalent. Can you talk a little bit, and you mentioned a little bit about some of the efforts that you guys are doing as far as some of the acoustic surveys and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about the Non-Game Wildlife Fund and how that impacts your work before we jump into the audience questions?
Yeah, definitely. So the Non-Game Wildlife Fund is a source of funding that comes through a lot of donations that people can either provide through their taxes or through estate planning, things like that, or even direct donations online. And it helps us gather federal dollars. There's a 9-to-4 match, essentially, for what we get. And we use these funds to increase our research efforts, to improve our monitoring. So we've used these money to purchase additional bat detectors that we use to cover the whole state of Indiana. We've even used some of this money to get bat gates up on caves to help protect the bats during hibernation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So now I will turn things over to the audience. Please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask all of your bat-related questions. That way we can get to talking about what you want to know about bats. And while we're waiting on those questions to roll in, I have a question of my own because this happens to me every year and it relates to bats and I'm not really sure what to do. So I wanted to get good information from the experts. So I live in an older home and I get bats roosting in my home, or they somehow get in. I usually only have one, so I'm assuming it's just like a scraggler here and there. But how do I get the bat out? What do I need to do there?
Bats can get into homes through very tiny openings, as small as about the diameter of a dime or a nickel, maybe. So you might think your home's completely sealed, but you might have that one little opening that bats use to get in. People also open garage doors or open windows or just open their front door, and bats can get in that way too. So if you just have a single bat kind of flying around in your living spaces, it's no reason for alarm. Usually if you just leave a window or a door open, the bat will eventually fly out on its own. The bat doesn't want to be in your house any more than you want it to be there. Sometimes people will have bats roosting in their attic or their chimney. Again, it's not a big reason for alarm, but it's obviously maybe not something that is ideal for your home. In that case, you can always contact the DNR for advice, and there are professionals who can come to your home to help you evict and humanely get rid of those bats from your house without harming them, and also without having any risk to harm to yourself. So it kind of depends if you just have a single bat that happens to fly in, or bats that are actually using your house for a roosting location. If you don't want to just leave a door open or a window open, you can always put on gloves and try to trap the bat in a cardboard box or maybe a pillowcase. That's totally fine to do, and then just take it outside and release it outside. If you do that, just please take precautions to avoid any direct contact with the bat.
And sometimes you might find, a bat that's out in like the middle of your lawn or, the middle of your driveway. It's kind of by itself. It maybe looks a little weak and sluggish. You could fill out a sick and dead wildlife report that Indiana DNR has, get that submitted. If you provide photos, we can even identify the bat down to the species in most cases. And then we can give you advice on, contacting a local wildlife rehabilitator near you to get that bat the help that it needs. A lot of times, some of these bats, they just need to get out of the sun and into shade, so we can give you guidance on how to do that. But we do want to be cautious to make sure that people and wildlife are, respecting each other and no one's getting injured in the process. Something else that can be done when you have bats in a home or in a structure and you're trying to evict them is to put up a bat box, because that is a very good way to sort of show that you have alternative habitat in the area. Perhaps as you start to evict them, they will move into that bat box. And at the very least, they can get out of your attic space or wherever you're trying to get them out of. And they'll know that there's additional roosting opportunities near you so that you still benefit from the free pest control the bats provide.
Excellent information. Thank you so much. It looks like somebody has a bat house up already, and they are wanting to know, today they observed the bats that are in their bat house hanging out of the bottom of that bat house. Is that because of the heat? Are the bats okay in this heat?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as the summer gets hotter, that might be a concern, that the bats are too hot and they're sort of, getting towards the bottom end of that so they can get in some more airflow and cool down. As you move further up in that bat house, it's going to get a lot hotter. So it could be that they're trying to get into some cooler portions of that bat box. It really depends on the size of the box too. So if you have a larger bat box with multiple chambers, there's more opportunities for bats to escape the heat, for example. But if it's a smaller bat box with a single chamber, so only one area for them to move around in, they definitely could be moving to the bottom to escape the heat. In our region, bat boxes should be painted like a medium brown color so it doesn't get too hot. And then it can depend on, what side of a building or a post you have that bat box posted to depend on like how much light it's going to get and how warm it will get too. Tim, do you have any other thoughts on why they might be hanging out of that bat box?
No, I think that pretty much is exactly right. Bats will often have multiple roosts that they use throughout the summer too. So as long as the bats are hanging there and looking okay, I wouldn't be too worried about it. If it does just get too hot in there for them, they're not just going to stay in there until it's way too hot for them. They'll go somewhere else, and some other roost they have that's a little more suitable to what they're looking for at this time of year. And then they may come back later in the year when it's a little cooler as well. So as long as they're hanging there and looking okay, they're maybe just trying to cool down, and they probably do have other roosts to go to as well.
That definitely makes sense. I mean, I know I'm out on my porch when it gets too hot, right? So me and bats having something in common. I love that. We have another question in here, and this one is about white nose syndrome. So something really serious. And if you could just give us a little background on white nose syndrome before you answer, for anybody who's not familiar, that'd be really helpful. But the question is, are we seeing a resurgence of bat populations after the decline from white nose syndrome? And has there been any cure or technique that we know of to help with the syndrome?
Yeah, so white nose syndrome is a fungal disease. It's actually a lot like athlete's foot that affects humans. But it was first found in the United States in 2006 in New York. It likely came from a cave in Europe, where bats have likely coexisted with a similar fungus for thousands and thousands of years. In Europe, you do see lower populations of bats, so it's possible there was a die-off from a similar fungus a long time ago in Europe. Likely somebody went to Europe, went into a cave, was exposed to this fungus, brought it back to the United States, and went into a cave here and kind of began the whole process of spreading this fungus to bats in the United States. We found it in Indiana in January of 2011. And since then, we have seen 2 or 3 of our species decline by almost 90%. So it's a very detrimental disease to some of our cave hibernating species. The fungus does only affect bats that hibernate in caves. Some of our bats are migratory, so they are not affected. In the first few years, we did see a lot of death of some of our bat species. Since then, our numbers have bottomed out, stabilized, and in recent years, we have seen numbers start to come back up a little bit. It's by no means a complete recovery. We're not even close to that. And we have not seen any of our species completely extirpated or wiped out from the state. But we have seen a couple of those species that were severely affected by this fungus start to come back a little bit. So that is a positive sign. The fungus, it basically just causes bats to wake up during hibernation, burn through their fat reserves, and then they don't have enough fat stored up to survive until the spring when their food sources become available again. So it usually kind of makes them either starve to death, or they might even exit their hibernation spot and search for food or just someplace else, and then they might die from exposure as well.
Yeah, and it's an interesting pathogen because the bats that go into hibernation, every winter they reinfect themselves with this fungus when they go into a cave. And then if they can survive until spring and they can emerge and there are insects on the landscape, they can actually get out there, start feeding on insects, and heal from the effects of white nose syndrome. And then as the temperature warms up and the bat becomes more active, they can actually rid themselves of that fungus and then, live a happy, healthy summer through fall and get ready for winter again. But then they have to go through it again the next winter.
Interesting. Thank you so much. Okay, it looks like our next question, we have a couple of them that are a little bit of concerns about whether bats are safe. One of them says, do bats have rabies, or are bats with rabies common? And then what do we do if a person or a pet has contact with a bat?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, are bats safe? I would say that yes, bats are definitely safe, but you want to be cautious with any wildlife, right? You don't want to go up and try to grab any wildlife species. And for a bat, they're a very small animal, and to them, we probably seem like very large predators. So they're going to treat us in a way that, a small prey item would, and that's, showing their teeth, maybe making some noise at you or trying to get away from you. If they feel backed in a corner, they might only try to show their teeth. And for us, that definitely is, something that is a little threatening. But rabies in bats, especially in North America, is relatively rare. It's thought that it occurs in only, 1% of all bats that are on the landscape. And of the bats that get submitted to the Department of Health in Indiana, only about 10 to 20 a year come back as positive. And those are, among hundreds of bats that get submitted for being suspect for rabies. So it's really rare amongst all the other bats that are flying around just doing normal bat stuff in a given summer.
Yeah,
That's
and
actually-
oh, sorry, Mariah. I'll
Go
just
ahead,
jump in
Tim.
there and kind of add to Brad's thoughts there. So most people do vaccinate their pets for rabies. And if your pet is vaccinated, it should be fine. You might want to go see your vet just as a precautionary measure to check up. But that's one of the reasons why it's important to vaccinate your pets, especially if they're outdoor pets. Cats and dogs, they're very curious. They see something moving, they go and investigate. And if they come into close contact with a bat, the bat will defend itself, and they could be bitten, or they could have a potential exposure. But as long as your pets are vaccinated, they should be okay. As far as people go, if there's any risk of a rabies exposure, you do just want to go see your medical provider as soon as possible. And also, if you can, save the bat, whether it's alive or dead. If you can either trap it or just save it for rabies testing, that's very important, because then it can just be tested. If it's negative, you're fine. You don't need any further treatment. So those are the two big things. If there's a potential human exposure, go see your doctor and save the bat if you can. Rabies is generally only spread through bites. It can be spread through a scratch occasionally, but you do have to have direct contact with the bat. So if you just see a bat in your house and you throw it outside, you're probably fine. But if there is a potential exposure, it's obviously a serious disease, and you should take it seriously.
And the state actually does take it very seriously. I had a bat exposure recently where I had to submit the bat to my county health department, and everyone who was involved with that process treated it like it was very serious. They were able to get back to me within minutes of calling. They took the bat, they got it tested, and I had results within 36 hours. So I felt very relieved to know that bat was negative, and that I was, safe to proceed without getting additional vaccinations.
That's great to hear, Brad. I didn't really know what the process was, so I feel like that's super helpful and just informative all around about the chances of getting rabies and kind of what that looks like. Our next question has to do a little bit with your guys' work with monitoring our bat populations in the state. So can you let us know, did you perform any bat counts during the hibernation period last fall and winter? And if you did, what did those numbers look like as compared to the previous year? So were the populations better, worse? Are there other concerns we need to know about?
As we kind of already talked about, white nose syndrome was sort of our big change in bat populations recently. In recent years, we haven't seen any changes nearly as extreme as that. One big concern is the expansion of wind energy. Renewable energy is great, and there's lots of great things about it. Unfortunately, sometimes there are still negatives, and one of the negatives is that wind turbines will kill and harm migratory bats, especially, but any bat species that are around a wind farm. Migratory bats will just naturally pass through a wind farm area. Sometimes bats might see a wind turbine and identify it as a tree that they could maybe hang out in. There's just a lot going on, and because of that, there is a lot of concern for especially our migratory bat species, and two bat species in particular, the hoary bat and the eastern red bat. Some people have seen pretty big declines in those species because of wind farms. There is a lot of research going into wind turbine technology as far as ways to deter bats from coming into the area, or simply just not generating electricity when there's a low demand for electricity, but a higher likelihood of bat activity. So that's kind of the big thing we're worried about right now as far as a potential serious extreme decline in bat populations. We have been doing regular winter, summer, and now we're even starting some spring and fall wind turbine area surveys. And apart from the wind turbines, we kind of previously mentioned that some of our cave hibernating bats are starting to come back a little bit from white nose syndrome. Another species that we are very concerned about is the northern long-eared bat. It's a small bat species. It's been affected by white nose syndrome, and we just don't see nearly as many of that bat species as we used to. It used to be somewhat common, but now we whether we're misnetting or doing acoustic studies or looking at bats in caves in the wintertime, we just hardly ever see that species anymore. So along with the migratory bats and wind farms, we're very concerned about northern long-eared bats. The little brown bat and the tricolored bat were two other species that were very much affected by white nose syndrome, but they do seem to be stabilizing. We do see those species in caves in comparable numbers to recent years. So even though those species declined a lot, we're a little more optimistic that those species have stabilized and are starting to come back.
We even have some bat species that we found this past winter while we were doing some cave surveys that are actually increasing. We think it's a northward expansion of the species, but we have the federally endangered gray bats in some of our Indiana caves. And this is more of a southern or southeastern bat species, and we found over 16,000 of them this past winter. Typically, 10 years ago, we would have found maybe 10, maybe a dozen, not that many. So it's impressive that we have this increasing winter population and increasing summer maternity population where females are actually making roosts in caves or abandoned quarries here in Indiana, which is cool to see. We also had record number Indiana bats this past winter. And the next highest number we had was back in 2007. So we're trying to figure out, did all these Indiana bats, come into Indiana from other states? Did they just move from caves into this, into the single caves that we have here? Or is it a combination of like reproduction? The populations are truly growing, and we're seeing something very positive with the species.
Yeah, Indiana bats, they're a little bit bigger than some of our other bat species that were more affected by white nose syndrome. So they are, just because they have just more fat, they're kind of able to survive about with the disease more than some other species. But we have seen a huge decline in Indiana bats in our northern caves, our northern hibernacula. But at the same time as we've seen a huge decline in our northern hibernacula, we've seen a huge increase in our southern caves. And that's likely a response to white nose syndrome in bats going farther south, where winters are a little less severe. They don't have to be in hibernation quite as long. There's food available earlier in the spring. So that's a really kind of fascinating change in behavior, biology that we've seen in the Indiana bat as a response to white nose syndrome. And it's great Brad mentioned the gray bats, because historically it's kind of a periphery species in Indiana. We're sort of right on the edge of the range, and I didn't even think about it when I was thinking about changes in our bat populations, but yeah, we are seeing huge increases in gray bats in Indiana now.
That's so exciting. And it's always exciting to see that to hear that we're getting a new species in the state, which is really cool. And you mentioned something, I just want to make sure that I was understanding everything. So you mentioned the word hibernacula. Does that mean areas in which bats hibernate?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
In Indiana, It basically just means a cave or possibly an abandoned mine. Occasionally bats will hibernate in an old barn or maybe a cellar or something like that. But mostly when we say hibernacula, we're just talking about caves that bats sleep during the winter in.
Okay, good deal. I just wanted to make sure I had that right. So we have a few more questions here, and just for the audience's reference, any questions we don't get to today, we will send out an email afterwards with answers to those questions to everybody who registered. So you'll still get those answers, which is great. A couple other things. It looks like we had a lot of questions about viewing the data that you all collect, which is awesome. And so I just wanted to direct the audience that Alexandra has kindly put in a link to the 2023 State of the Bats report for anybody who's interested in viewing that data. But our next question here is, when will we start seeing pups or baby bats emerge?
So we should be seeing pups right about now. I was actually on Facebook the other night, and I saw someone post a picture of a young big brown bat, from the looks of it, that had fallen out of its roost, and they were seeking guidance on like how to get it back to its mom. So we can see pups anytime from now through the end of July, maybe even mid-August. These baby bats are born relatively helpless. They're furless. They can't fly. They're totally reliant on their mothers for milk for about 6 to 8 weeks. During that time, they develop rapidly. They grow larger, they get their fur, they get strong enough that they can try to fly. And by the end of that 6 to 8 weeks, then they start to expand their wings, their hands, and try to fly a little bit. But these young bats tend to get into bad situations. You know, they don't know where the best roosts are. They sometimes end up on people's porches or in houses more often compared to adult bats, just because they don't know what to look for yet. Maybe they get weak. They get a little bit tired from their flight and they need a rest. And that's how they get into these bad situations.
Okay, good information. Thank you so much for that. And I think our last question here has to do with what are some of the good things that bats provide for us? So what are the benefits to having bats within our environment?
Yeah, lots of benefits and different benefits depending on where in the world you are. I'll start out and just say that all of our bat species in Indiana are insectivorous bats. They eat insects, beetles, moths, and mosquitoes. So that has a huge benefit for the agricultural industry and natural pest control. Those bats eat a ton of agricultural pests that could otherwise be eating farmers' crops. It also means farmers have to use fewer pesticides to control the insects in their farms. So that is one huge benefit of bats in Indiana. They also do eat mosquitoes. It's usually not their primary food source, but mosquitoes obviously are vectors or carriers of diseases that can affect people. So simply by having bats out there to eat some mosquitoes, it's also advantageous for human health and just mitigating some serious diseases out there.
Definitely. And then, you know, globally, bats are very important for pollinating a lot of species of plants. They are, some eat blood, some eat nectar, some actually eat fruit. And in those areas where they do eat fruit, they, you know, tend to spread the seeds of some of these plants further and faster than other animals could. And they help with reforestation wherever, you know, agriculture or deforestation has occurred. So bats globally are truly phenomenal. But here in Indiana, you can definitely see the human benefits because of bats in that free pest control. We have healthier, you know, agriculture, healthier forests and everything because of bats. And unfortunately, bats are flying around at night doing this, so they don't get the attention or the recognition that they really deserve for this awesome service they provide us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for explaining that. That leads us right into our next question. Is there anywhere where people can go to see bats? Or do you have any suggestions about how people can safely see bats, safe for people and for the bats?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, Indiana doesn't have any, you know, caves like Mammoth Cave or like Carlsbad Cavern where you could go and sit out there and watch bats leaving this, you know, beautiful environment. But what we do have is bats that cover the entire state during the summer months. And so if you know, take a couple of evenings to just sort of, you know, enjoy your own company, enjoy the company of some friends and family, sit out right after the sun is set, and just sort of, you know, gaze your eyes towards the sky as twilight gets a little bit darker and a little bit darker. And you should start to see bats starting to fly around in your neighborhood. I've done some presentations in Indianapolis and other areas, you know, in northern Indiana, where I wasn't sure if I'd see a bat, and I had to like let some school kids down. It was like, we may not be bats in this area. I'm not too sure. And then sure enough, there's bats flying over us. So wherever you are, you're more than likely going to be able to see bats in the evening here in Indiana.
Yeah, that twilight time, it's amazing how many bats are out there that you just never realize or see or think about. But if you just kind of take a few minutes to go out at twilight and look up, it's very possible you'll see a bat flying around. I'd also say we do have a cave in southern Indiana called Wyandotte Cave that does have cave tours between Memorial Day and Labor Day, or Labor Day and Memorial Day. I can never keep those two straight, but between those two in the summer. And you probably won't see a ton of bats in there because during the summer, the bats are out of the cave and reproducing and doing things on the landscape. But it's possible you will see a few bats flying around in there while you're in there. In the fall, usually September, October time, Indiana State University also has an event called Bat Fest. And it's an event where just people from all over the state go to give bat presentations, all sorts of different talks about bats and demonstrations about bats. They have a They have an artificial cave that kids can go into and have a good time, things like that. And one of the things they do often have at that event is a bat rehabilitator who comes with, typically it's a fruit bat that has been injured in the wild and can't be released back into the wild because it wouldn't survive. So they then use that bat or a few bats that they might have, depending on the time, to travel around and educate people about bats, which is really cool to see real bats in real life. And so Bat Fest is another great place to experience bats.
Awesome, great suggestions. It sounds like there are a lot more opportunities to maybe get to see bats in our area than I thought there were. So with that, that would be our final question tonight. We've reached our 6:30 timeline, so I want to be respectful of everybody in the audience's time, but thank you both so much for attending and joining us today. As I mentioned before, we will follow up with everybody who registered for this event for any questions that weren't answered but were asked, so we'll make sure we still get that information to y'all. And feel free to keep an eye out on our social media channels and YouTube channel for the recording of this event to share with people that you might know in your life who are interested in bats. So that will be coming in a couple of weeks. Thank you both so much, and I hope everybody has a great evening.